It's the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccerphiles Canada. We're looking at World Cup 2026 qualifying in the Asian region. This is round one, the preliminary round. Our ninth pairing is Chinese Taipei versus East Timor. Here we go. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada, Series 21. I'm Kevin, and we are at the beginning of a massive set of series looking at World Cup 2026 qualifying. Series 21 will cover 3 rounds of qualifying for the Asian region, or AFC, and this is the 9th of 10 media casts covering the preliminary round of qualifying. These are the bottom 20 teams in the AFC region playing home and away, the 10 winners advancing to the second round. This then is set 10 of 10, covering Chinese Taipei versus East Timor. And we've been wanting to cover the weaker countries in world soccer because they get so little attention. Most media casts focus on the big teams, but these small teams have an interesting history too. However, some of them never get on the radar, partly because they're often knocked out in early rounds. In addition, they're often hard to separate, and in the minds of even ardent soccer fans, they just clump into a nebulous category of weak teams that finish at the bottom of tables. Part of the goal here, then, is to make them more distinct. Throughout, we will be mentioning the teams that they beat or teams that usually beat them. We name them on purpose so that fans can, little by little, build an impression of how strong each team is relative to those around them. At this point, we usually give some information about our past, present, and future media casts. However, we don't want too much information in our introduction here, so we have made a separate media cast that covers what we've been doing recently and what we plan to cover over the next 9 months. It'll be published around October 15th, 2023, and can also be found at the addresses that YouTube watchers can see on the graphic. Also, we will give a link to that in the show notes. Okay, but on with the show here. We are covering the 9th of 10 preliminary pairings, and in part 1 we will introduce a little bit about the 2 countries competing, their location and population, and in this case their political situation a little bit. Part 2, we will do an overview of each team's history and their recent form. So this series features a deep dive into each team's history in World Cup qualifying. The Asian region is further divided into what we call localities, and they play a big role. So in part 2, we do touch on this often neglected aspect of the team's history. And then part 3 will be a comparison of the 2 teams in terms of ranking, head-to-head record, and odds. And we will end with a discussion of their prospects and our prediction as to who will advance from this round. All right, let's jump into it, and we'll begin by looking at Chinese Taipei. So Chinese Taipei is actually Taiwan, but its name Chinese Taipei is kind of a compromise to not offend China, basically. China considers it a province, whereas Taiwan considers themselves an independent country. So Chinese Taipei kind of skirts making a decision on or taking a side on that, I guess. In terms of location, Taiwan is on the is off the east coast of China. And actually, if one goes directly south from South Korea, they will eventually hit the Philippines. But about 2/3 of the way down, they will find Taiwan a little bit west of that line. Okay, in terms of population, Chinese Taipei has 23.9 million people. That makes it the 57th largest country in the world and the 22nd in Asia. East Timor is on the the most southern island of the Indonesian archipelago, and the east side of the island is East Timor, whereas the west side of the island is part of Indonesia. And actually, East Timor lies just 650 kilometers northwest of Darwin, Australia. Darwin, a northern city in Australia. The population of East Timor is 1.4 million. It's 155th in the world and 46th in Asia, making it one of the smallest countries in Asia. All right, let's move on to the histories, and we'll begin with an overview of Chinese Taipei in terms of their participation and strength. Chinese Taipei is an old country, so I'm having trouble fitting it all on one screen for the YouTube viewers, and the writing is very small there, but really you just kind of need to look at the colors at this point, and we will enlarge them as we go through each section. So again, known outside of the soccer world as Taiwan, in deference to China's view of them as a province, they're called Chinese Taipei, usually in sports events. They entered the World Cup very early in 1954, but withdrew from that and from the 1958 edition, and did not enter again until 1978, from which time they've participated consistently. For the Asian Cup, they did participate in the first two editions in 1956 and 1960, but then dropped out. And with the exception of the fourth edition in 1968, they didn't return until 1992. Finally, their local group started later than those in other areas of the Asian Confederation, but they have been consistent in participating in every edition since 2003. That tournament taking place every 2 to 3 years. And I was neglected not saying that they are part of the East Asian Football Federation, which we will look at in more detail shortly. In terms of strength, Chinese Taipei is currently a fifth-tier team. They have had short periods of being stronger. The Asian Cups in the 1960s, the 1982 World Cup qualifying campaign, and the final round of their Asian Cup campaign in 2009, showing some recent strength there above the level of fifth tier. But while they generally seem at the stronger end of the fifth tier, more often beating teams of this level, they have had long periods, especially a long period from 2006 to 2018, where they actually seemed weaker than other fifth-tier teams, and losing the balance of games against those teams. But recent times, as we've mentioned, show a slight revival. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit on World Cup here, the World Cup history. And Chinese Taipei first entered the World Cup in 1978, and until 1994, they were part of a kind of an ambiguous region involving mostly South Pacific or Oceania teams, along with a few extraneous teams. They were part of the AFC, or the Asian division, but for some reason were kind of grouped with teams outside the AFC for World Cup qualifying. They lost all games to these teams over the 4 editions, except for a remarkable campaign in 1982, where they did much better. That earned them only a fourth of fifth place finish, though, but it remains by far their most competitive campaign. From 1994, they were grouped with Asian Confederation teams, and generally they did poorly. 1998 showed some competitiveness, and they did win preliminary rounds when paired with teams of similar strength. But if they reached the semi-final round, they lost all games once there. Generally, these teams are well above their level, but in 2018, they were twice beaten by a team close to their level. And we will take a closer look at that because World Cup qualifying is the deep dive for this series. Let's move on to an overview of their Asian Cup history. So like in 1982 in World Cup qualification, they have had some early success in the Asian Cup. These were in 1960 and 1968, where they came third and fourth respectively. A long absence from the Cup followed, and when they returned in 1992, they were a far weaker team. They did earn a single result for points in each of the following tournaments until 2004, but at best it earned them second last place finishes over feeble teams. In 2007, they lost all games in their campaign. Actually, most weak teams didn't play the 2007 Asian Cup. They had moved in 2006 down to the AFC Challenge Cup, which is a tournament that was designed for weaker teams in the region and which they played in lieu of the Asian Cup. Chinese Taipei, for some reason, was one of only a few countries to compete in both. Or in 2007 only, I should point out. Naturally, the Challenge Cup was a better fit for them, and they reached the quarterfinals of the first edition. After that, they didn't qualify and generally performed poorly, dropping points to fifth-tier teams, many of whom they had been beating in World and Asian Cup qualifying beforehand. In 2019, all teams in the region returned to a newly formatted Asian Cup. Their weakness took them there through a circuitous route to the final round of Asian Cup qualifying, where they performed very well, almost like a strong third-tier team. That earned them a bye for the 2023 preliminary round. And we'll take a look at that shortly. Or, sorry, we'll take a look at that in the recent game section, is not actually shortly. Okay, but let's move on with our overviews and look at their local cup. So their regional group is the East Asian Football Federation, or EAFF, and that consists of 10 countries. So the tournament has only 4 spots, and China, South Korea, and Japan automatically get 3 of them. North Korea or Hong Kong invariably make up the other spot. But there is a qualification for the weaker teams, and so basically for them, that qualification is the tournament. Those teams are, along with Chinese Taipei, Mongolia, Macau, Guam, and as of 2008, the Northern Mariana Islands. Chinese Taipei showed a pattern of growing weaker until recently, that pattern consistent with their Asian Cup play. And they came very close to qualifying in 2003 when they finished tied with Hong Kong, but behind on goal difference. But they grew ever farther from reaching the finals, which they have never done. Beating Guam in 2008 and 2010, drawing with them in 2013, and then losing to that very weak team in 2015. From 2018, however, they seem to have regained strength in terms of dominating fifth-tier teams like Guam in the group, but they are still no match for Hong Kong and for North Korea. All right, let's go into our deep dive then. And Chinese Taipei first actually entered the World Cup in 1954, and they were placed in a group with South Korea and Japan, but they withdrew from that group before playing any games. In 1958, they also entered and withdrew. There they were in a group, a knockout round with Indonesia, and of course Indonesia advanced automatically when Chinese Taipei withdrew. From 1962 to 1974, they simply didn't enter the Cup. And so their first real qualification there was in 1978. And as we mentioned before, it was part of a kind of a nebulous catch-all group that involved South Pacific teams and some other countries not firmly attached to a confederation. They thus competed with New Zealand and Australia in their first qualification in 1978 and unsurprisingly lost all games. 1982 added Fiji and Indonesia to the group, and Chinese Taipei did very well at home, going undefeated. They tied all games except for a win over Indonesia, and they finished fourth or fifth. I should say, but they finished fourth or fifth, because you would expect that home record to earn them a better result, but just fourth place ahead of Fiji. And actually, New Zealand beat out Australia in that 1982 campaign. In 1986, it was Australia and New Zealand again, as well as Israel, and they lost all games here heavily. They had a goal record of one goal for and 36 goals against over the 6 games. 1990 was just a knockout round, and they were paired with New Zealand and had little chance there, losing both games. 1994 normalized into competition among Asian teams, but when Myanmar withdrew, Chinese Taipei's chance of earning a point went with them, and they lost all games to Iran, Syria, and Oman, much stronger teams there. 1998 did give them a chance to get some points, and they took it with an away win in Bangladesh, who they finished ahead of. Actually, both teams won their away games there, and a home draw over Malaysia gave Chinese Taipei one more point to finish ahead of Bangladesh. The following campaign in 2002 once again grouped them with teams above their level, and there, and in 2006, where they at least beat Macau in a preliminary round, they lost all games in the semi-final rounds. 2010 pitted them against Uzbekistan in the first round, and they stood little chance, losing 9-0 in the away leg there. In 2014, they proved competitive with Malaysia in the first round. They lost 2-1 in the first leg away and then won 3-2 at home. But with away goals as the advancing criterion, Malaysia advanced, having scored 2 goals away compared to Chinese Taipei's 1. As one of the 12 weakest teams in the region, in 2018, they were required to play in the preliminary round, and things looked dire when they lost at home to the very weak Brunei. However, they saved face by winning by a wider margin in the away leg, and they again reached the semi-final round, but lost all games there against tough opposition, Iraq, Thailand, and Vietnam. 2022, they were not one of the 12 lowest ranked teams, and so didn't have to play in the preliminary round. We're going to take a closer look at that competition in the recent game section. But 2026 saw the preliminary round expanded to 20 teams, so they were part of the preliminary round, or they are part of the preliminary round, because that's actually what we're discussing in this media cast. Okay, that brings us to the recent section, and we begin that with the Asian Cup in 2029, and you're going to see the lengths that Asia goes to, to give these weaker teams a few chances. And later, when we look at EAFF, we'll see a disappointment as far as that goes. Anyway, 2019 Asian Cup. Actually, 2018 World Cup qualifying made up the first 2 rounds of qualification. And so we already saw that they lost to Brunei at home in the first game, but managed to advance from the round by winning by a larger margin away. We also saw that in the second round, they lost all games to stronger teams. And because of that, because of their fourth place finish in the group, they didn't advance to the final round of qualifying. However, the Asian region gives chances to weaker teams to overcome that. So they actually had two playoff rounds, giving teams that didn't automatically advance a chance. In the first of these playoff rounds, they faced Cambodia and they tied at home in the first leg and lost in the second. So Cambodia advanced to the final round and they did not. However, they advanced to another chance to reach the final round, and they took it by beating East Timor twice, and advancing. Actually, both legs were played in Taiwan there. We're giving them an advantage. They won 2-1 in both games. So in a very circuitous route, they made it to the final round of qualifying and actually did very well there. They beat Singapore, usually a stronger team. I'd say a fourth tier team in both legs, and they also beat Bahrain in the home leg, a second tier team there. A second to third tier team is Bahrain, and finished third in the group, well ahead of Singapore, and just 1 point behind an advancing spot, 1 point behind Turkmenistan, who they lost both games to, just short of reaching the cup there. So a really surprising performance by Chinese Taipei in 2019. As we said, coming out of a weak period from 2006 to 2018. Let's see if they were able to maintain this in the next tournament. That was the 2019 EAFF Cup, their local cup among East Asian teams, and they were strong enough to receive a bye in the first round of qualifying there. And in the main round of qualifying, they lost to Hong Kong and North Korea. So a bit unlucky to be grouped. Actually, I do think there was just one group there. So that's who they would invariably meet in this round. They did beat Mongolia 2-1, but that was only good enough for a third place finish. And only the top team advances there. So they were well short of the cup, as they always have been. Next tournament is the World Cup in 2022. And, they had earned enough points in that 2019 Asian Cup campaign to receive a bye, not one of the 12 teams required to play the preliminary round there. But they got to the final round and lost all games. That was to be expected against Australia, Kuwait, and Jordan, but they could have done a little bit better against Nepal, who they lost both legs to by a score of 2-0. So finishing last in the group there. Then we come to the 22 East Asian Football Federation Cup, and here we see an uncharacteristic situation in Asia. We said they give weak teams a lot of chances, but in this case, they didn't even hold a qualifying campaign for this cup. Already it's a bit elitist, although understandable that Japan, South Korea, and China automatically receive a spot in the 4-team cup. But in this case, they didn't bother with qualifying and just picked the top 4 ranked teams. So the weaker teams didn't get the qualifying, which, as I said, is kind of their tournament. So I was very surprised by that. This is more characteristic of CONCACAF than it is of Asia. So the Asian Cup qualifying was for 2023 was the next tournament they played in. And again, the first 2 rounds of 2022 World Cup qualifying made up the first 2 rounds here. We saw that they received a bye in the first round and then lost all games in the second, even to Nepal. And that meant a last place finish in the group. We also saw in the previous Asian Cup that there are playoff rounds for those who don't qualify automatically to the next round. And that was the case for Chinese Taipei. They went into a playoff round with Indonesia and lost both legs. And this time it was the end of the road for them, just one round of playoffs. As opposed to two in the previous Asian Cup. Those who don't make it through to the final round go to a tournament called the Solidarity Cup. And this is a bit of I consider it a revised version of the Challenge Cup. It's a tournament for weak teams, specifically for those who don't reach the final round of qualifying. So again, it's another kind of good tournament for the weakest teams in the region. However, in 2020, that tournament wasn't played. It was cancelled due to COVID. So it turned out that the end of the line for Chinese Taipei there was their loss in the playoff round with Indonesia. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our look at Chinese Taipei. And now we turn to the team that they play in the 2026 preliminary round, East Timor. So we'll begin with an overview of their participation and strength. East Timor is actually one of the newest teams in the world, first participating in the World Cup in 2010 and participating consistently since. Their first Asian Cup entry was quite a bit earlier in 2004. However, they did not complete another qualification until 2019. And furthermore, they were suspended from the 2023 edition. So really, they've just participated in two editions. In their local group, which is also the East Asian Football Federation, they first entered in 2004 and have been very consistent, not missing any of the 11 additions to 2022. In terms of strength, East Timor is a fifth-tier team, but unlike Chinese Taipei, they're really at the bottom of that scale, actually almost justifying the creation of a sixth tier. But that is muddied by the competitiveness that they showed in the 2019 World Cup campaign, which, as we know, doubles as the early rounds of 2019 Asian Cup. They were really good, or they were comparatively really good, relatively really good, until they were found to be using Brazilian-born players in some of those games. Which kind of made them look far more competitive. Without them, they lose by heavy margins and are weak among even the fifth-tier teams. We'll take a look at that 2019 campaign, both here and in the deep dive. So here means the World Cup overview. So East Timor joined the World Cup in 2010, but have fallen at the preliminary round in all cases except for 2018. There they beat Mongolia in both legs of the preliminary round, and they even earned two draws in the semi-final round. However, their use of Brazilian-born players was questioned, and only much later did it come to light that documents had been forged, making these Brazilian players appear to be naturalized citizens. So really, we can't consider those results in 2018 valid. Their true strength without those players was evident in the final games of the 2018 campaign and in the preliminary games of the 2022 campaigns, where they lost heavily without the aid of those Brazilian players. Okay, moving on to the Asian Cup. We noted that they had joined this much earlier in 2004, but there they lost to two fifth-tier teams in a preliminary group. They were kind of weak. They were the kind of weak team for which the AFC Challenge Cup was developed, a team too weak to compete in the Asian Cup. However, they didn't enter the 2006 edition, and they withdrew from the 2008 edition. In fact, they didn't enter any of the Challenge Cups. I don't know why I didn't put it this way, but they didn't enter any of the Challenge Cup and were basically out of the Regional Cup by their own choice until 2019. When all teams in the region returned to a new qualifying system for the Asian Cup, which now expanded to 24 teams. World Cup qualification, as we said, made up the first 2 rounds of qualifying, and their last place finish at the semi-final round of qualifying qualified them, as we saw with Chinese Taipei, for a series of playoffs. But I think we're covering this stuff in the recent round, so I won't cover it here also. So really just prior to recent campaigns, just that 2004 campaign where they were knocked out in the preliminary round and didn't take part in the Challenge Cup. We said their participation in the local cup had been much more consistent. Oh, and I made a mistake. They are not part of the East Asian Football Federation. They're part of the Southeast Asian Football Federation. And they joined in 2004, the first tournament having been played in 1996. So that's held every 2 years, so they missed the first 3 editions. But other than that, their participation has been flawless since 2004. That region too also houses some of the weakest teams in the world. So they qualified only in 2004 when qualification was automatic. But despite participating every time, they only came close to qualifying in 2012 when they took a jump forward relative to other weak teams in the region. But there is, or kind of I suspect that when they showed that strength, they might have been getting away with having players on their team who weren't really eligible. So again, in 2018 and 2020, they reached the cup and did well, but there is suspicion of illegal players there. So anyway, what we do know is once those players became unavailable to them, without those players, they're a very weak team, even among fifth-tier teams, capable only of beating Brunei. Okay, let's take a look at the World Cup final, or the World Cup qualifying in detail in our deep dive. Their first entry into the World Cup in 2010 saw them paired with Hong Kong in a knockout round. They looked competitive in the home leg, which was actually played in Indonesia, losing by a competitive score of 3-2, but in the away leg they lost 8-1 and were quickly eliminated. 2014 was a more gentle pairing in the preliminary round, but because of a lack of infrastructure, both legs were played in Nepal. So once again, they were competitive in the first leg, losing only 2-1, but it was a heavy loss in the second leg, seeing them out of the cup at the preliminary stage. Ranked one of the 12 weakest teams in the region, they were required to play in the preliminary round in 2018. They won both legs there over Mongolia and proceeded to the semi-final round, where they started with a draw in Malaysia and later tied Palestine in the home leg. It was only after 5 games into the campaign that they were questioned on using Brazilian-born players throughout. So I believe Palestine questioned it after their draw. East Timor stopped using these players for the last 3 games of the campaign, and they lost heavily in those matches. Only much later did it come to light that documents making those players appear naturalized citizens were forged. It was too late to undo the results, and since they finished last in the group anyway, the table was left as it is. The real victims were Mongolia in the preliminary round, who could not be compensated. But punishment would be applied to East Timor in the form of a suspension from the 2023 Asian Cup. And that leads us into the next section, the recent history section, which begins with the 2019 Asian Cup. And we've looked at this a couple of times already because it was also World Cup 2018 qualifying. And we saw that they advanced from the preliminary round with 2 wins over Mongolia, tied Malaysia and Palestine in the semi-final round, but then were found to be using Brazilian imports, basically, and that wasn't discovered until about 5 games in. And the fact that the documents were forged was not discovered until well after the round. Anyway, they finished last place in that group despite those 2 draws, and we saw with Chinese Taipei that the Asian region offers many chances to the weak teams to make it to the final round. So 2 playoff rounds, they lost both. So the first playoff round, they lost 3-0 in both legs to Malaysia, and then in the second playoff round, lost both legs 2-1 to Taiwan. And even still, they're not completely out of things because the teams that don't make it to the final round go to the Solidarity Cup. And the Solidarity Cup saw them lose 4-0 to Brunei. Honestly, Brunei is one of the very weakest teams in the world. So a 4-0 loss to them is shocking, and again arguing the need for a 6th tier. But even if they were a 6th tier, Brunei would be in it. So that would make East Timor require a 7th tier. We won't get into that. We'll just call them a weak 5th tier team. Actually, in their second game, they did better, tying Nepal, who are really at the top of the 5th tier teams. So they did get some satisfaction out of it. But finished 3rd in the group, so did not advance to the finals there. Okay, the next cup was the 2020 ASEAN Cup, the Southeast Asian Federation, and there they were automatically in a group stage. I think usually 8 teams make it to the finals, but there's a couple of tournaments, a couple of editions where all 10 teams make it to the finals. That seems to have been the case here. They lost all 4 games in that 5-team group to Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines, and Singapore. So even Myanmar and Philippines, they're no match for. World Cup in 2022 saw them paired with Malaysia in the preliminary round. So that was a pretty tough grouping. I really think Malaysia shouldn't have been among the 12 weakest teams required to play the preliminary round. But there we have it, and Malaysia proved my case because they thrashed them 7-1 and 5-1, and I think they even did very well, or quite well, in the semi-final round too. So a bit of a tough draw for East Timor there. And local cup in 2022, the ASEAN Cup. This time there was a qualifying round. Once again, they lost heavily to Brunei. I can't emphasize how weak Brunei is. Really one of the weakest teams in the world, and they lost to them 6-2. However, they did beat them in the second leg, 1-0. A bit of a Pyrrhic victory, but Brunei advanced to the tournament while East Timor were left behind. 2023 Asian Cup qualifying, because of that debacle with Brazilian players and forged documents, they were disqualified from this cup, and that actually brings us to the end of East Timor's history. And we move on to an analysis of the two teams here. And we already see that it's maybe a foregone conclusion. Chinese Taipei ranked 29th in Asia. That's a bit of a jump up, as we'll see when we look at the rankings. And East Timor, so Chinese Taipei, third from the top in pot one, among the 10 teams in pot one. And East Timor, I think, even maybe overranked as the fourth weakest team in pot two and in Asia. So the pot placements definitely favoring Chinese Taipei. In terms of FIFA rankings, Chinese Taipei is ranked 153rd in FIFA, and East Timor is ranked 195th. So 42 points between them there. Those rankings, by the way, a little bit different than what we saw in the pot because they're the most recent rankings. In the ELO system, ELO, which is a ranking system that we trust a little bit more. It seems more accurate. Chinese Taipei is ranked 195th and East Timor 230th. So 35 points between them. Basically, both of them have a similar relative distance between the two teams. Let's take a quick look at FIFA rankings and ELO rankings over the course of time. And we'll actually see that Chinese Taipei is usually around 170th, but they went all the way up to 123 in FIFA rankings in June of 2018. That's because of that good round three where they beat Singapore twice and Bahrain once. Since then, though, they've dropped 30 points to where they are now, about 153. But that's still higher than they had been for most of the last decade. And that pattern is basically reflected in ELO rankings, though not as dramatically. That's why we like ELO rankings more. So they've gone from 200, about 205, up to about 190, and now back down to about 195. So slightly stronger than that period where they were doing poorly. So a bit of improvement over recent times. East Timor have basically remained at the same level. They really haven't shown anything. And as we said earlier, the debacle with the Brazilian players kind of muddled things. So they've always been around in the 190 to 200 range in FIFA, which is really at the bottom of the FIFA scale. The ELO rankings include more teams, but they're at the bottom of that scale too, around 200 and usually in the 220s. So they've hit a new low with 230. Moving on to their head-to-head record, we see that Chinese Taipei has a record of 3 wins and 0 ties and 0 losses to East Timor. So they met in 2004 Asian Cup qualifying in the preliminary round there, one of the few Asian Cups that East Timor was involved in. And on neutral ground, Chinese Taipei won 3-0. They also met in the 2019 Asian Cup qualifying, as we saw, kind of in the playoff rounds to try to reach the final round. And Chinese Taipei won both legs 2-1 with the advantage of playing both legs at home. So Chinese Taipei looking stronger there as well. For the odds, we did try to find odds over the course of 2 games, but we couldn't find that. All we could do was find odds for the first game, which takes place in Chinese Taipei. So they have the home advantage there. So along with all other advantages they have home advantage here. And for that game, they are given a 81% chance of winning compared to East Timor's 8%. Once again, we won't get into the mathematics of why that doesn't add up to 100%. I'm not sure, actually, if the East Timor game is going to be played in East Timor, whether they have the facilities to host games yet. But overall, I wouldn't expect the odds to be that different for the over the course of two games. Maybe it would be, even if I think 75% would suggest that Chinese Taipei would lose 1 out of every 4 times. I don't even see that as realistic. And I, in fact, don't even see these odds as realistic, because they suggest that East Timor would win 1 out of every 5 times, roughly. Yeah, depending on how you interpret the numbers. But I think actually Chinese Taipei are more likely to win than the odds suggest. And actually, I've already kind of launched into the discussion there, and I don't think there's a lot to discuss there. Chinese Taipei are stronger than East Timor in every aspect. They're at the higher end of the 5th tier team, whereas East Timor is an argument for creating a 6th tier. Chinese Taipei also are in better form, maybe not in the form of challenging 4th and 3rd tier teams and those above them. Maybe not in quite that form, but definitely in form to be beating 5th tier teams, especially weak ones like East Timor. So East Timor, always a bit of a black box. I think they actually do have some Brazilian immigration into the country, which in time may help them. I just think obviously you can't kind of fake that they are naturalized citizens. East Timor have shown a bit of spunk, a tie with Nepal in the 2016 Solidarity Cup, and but we've seen actually that they've lost games heavily to Brunei. So really, you can't give a team that does that much hope. So I would say there's a very, very slim chance of East Timor getting anything out of this set, and definitely we favor Chinese Taipei to advance from this group. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of set 9, Chinese Taipei versus East Timor, and we look forward to meeting you when we look at the last of our set of 10 preliminary games. That is Nepal versus Laos. We would like to thank Pixabay and Amaxi for the use of the music in this series titled Caledon, or Caledon Flute Beat.